I need to tell you something before I get into this. I'm not someone who dramatizes things. That's important for you to understand before I say anything else, because everything I'm about to tell you is going to sound like exactly the kind of story that gets dramatized. I'm a field biologist. I've spent the better part of the last decade in remote locations, boreal forests, alpine meadows, coastal wetlands, places where the nearest road is measured in hours, not minutes. I've slept alone in tents during storms that should have killed me. I've had bears walk through my camp at 2 a.m. and done nothing but lie still and breathe slowly until they left. I am not someone who spooks easily. I say all of this because what happened at Station 7 changed something in me that I haven't been able to change back. And I've spent 2 years now trying to find the right way to talk about it, trying to figure out how much detail is too much, how much is not enough, whether saying it out loud makes it more real or less. I still don't have a good answer. What I have is this. 3 weeks. 21 days. A research station in the middle of a boreal forest in northern Canada, surrounded by nothing in every direction for as far as any map was willing to show me. I went in alone. I was supposed to come out alone. What happened in between is the reason I check the tree line every time I step outside, even now, even here, even in places where I know, where I'm almost completely certain, that nothing is watching. Almost. The station. Station 7 wasn't much to look at. A main cabin, insulated walls, a wood stove, a desk, 2 cots I didn't need both of, and 2 smaller outbuildings, one for equipment storage, one for the generator. Solar panels on the south-facing roof supplemented the generator during the day. There was a satellite phone for emergencies, a shortwave radio for weather, and a data uplink terminal that sent automated readings back to the university every 6 hours whether I touched it or not. The nearest other human being was a forestry technician named Grant who ran a monitoring station 42 kilometers to the southeast and who I was supposed to check in with by radio every 3 days. I'd worked in stations like this before. The isolation doesn't bother me, genuinely doesn't. I find it clarifying. When there's nothing competing for your attention except the work in front of you and the sounds of a forest going about its business, something in your brain settles in a way it never does in the city. I was there to monitor a wolf pack, specifically, to collect behavioral data on a breeding pair and their most recent litter that had been collared and tracked by a different research team the previous winter. My job was observational. Sit in the blind, watch the den site through the spotting scope, record activity, note times, cross-reference with the collared data coming in on the terminal. 21 days of methodical, repetitive, quiet work. That was the plan. Days 1 through 5. The first 5 days were exactly what I expected. I set up my equipment, established my blind, about 200 meters from the den site, downwind, in a stand of spruce that gave good sight lines without putting me close enough to affect their behavior. The pack was there. The breeding female, the one they designated W4 in the collar data, was spending most of her time within 50 meters of the den. The male, W3, was ranging further, bringing back food, circling the perimeter. 3 pups, born in late April, still small enough that they rarely left the immediate area of the den entrance. I settled into a rhythm quickly. Up before dawn, in the blind by first light, observations until early afternoon, back to the station for data entry and equipment checks, out again in the late afternoon for the second observation window, back before dark. The forest around the station was dense, black spruce and tamarack, with sections of older growth where the canopy closed overhead and the light came through in slanted columns that made the whole place look like something that should have a soundtrack. I took my meals at the desk, read in the evenings, slept well. On day 3, I heard something move through the brush about 30 meters north of the station around 11 p.m. I noted it in my log as probable ungulate, moose or caribou. On day 4, I found a set of tracks in the soft mud near the water tank that I couldn't immediately identify. Larger than wolf, the wrong shape for bear. I photographed them, noted the dimensions, and moved on. Field biology produces unexplained observations constantly. That's most of what the work is, Unexplained observations that eventually accumulate into something you can call a conclusion. I wasn't alarmed. On day 5, I radioed Grant. He asked how the pack was behaving. I told him well. He told me a low-pressure system was moving in from the northwest, probably arriving day 7 or 8. I thanked him, signed off, went to bed. I remember thinking, before I fell asleep, that this was going to be a good 3 weeks. Clean data, cooperative subjects, good weather for most of it. I remember feeling fortunate. That was the last night I slept without waking at least once to listen to the dark. Day 6. It started with something small, the way these things always do. I came back from the morning observation window at 12:40 p.m. I had been in the blind for just under 5 hours. In that time, W4 had moved the pups twice, short relocations, maybe 15 meters each time, for no reason I could identify from the data. W3 had returned to the den site at 10:23, dropped a cache, and left again heading northeast at 10:51. Routine. I unlocked the station door, stepped inside, set my pack down on the cot, the same cot I always used, the one on the left, and went to the desk to start entering data. The chair was facing the window. I always left the chair facing the desk. Not as a rule I'd consciously made, just as a function of how I worked. I sat down, I worked, I stood up, the chair stayed where it was. I'd been at the station for 5 days and the chair had been facing the desk every time I came back to it. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. Then I thought, wind. The door had a gap at the bottom, and on particularly gusty days you could feel a draft move through the main cabin. Could a draft rotate a desk chair? I sat down, turned myself to face the desk, and entered my data. I didn't write it in the field log. Not that day. It seemed too minor, the kind of thing that becomes embarrassing to have recorded if it turns out to be nothing. I filed it instead in the part of my mind where I keep observations that don't yet have categories, and I went about my afternoon. That night, at 11:40 p.m., I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It was outside, that much I was sure of. Not wind, not the generator, not a branch settling. Something with a regular rhythm, which meant something alive. I lay still for a long time, listening. Whatever it was moved slowly around the north side of the station, paused for what I estimated was 3 to 4 minutes near the equipment shed, and then, nothing. Just silence, and then the normal sounds of a forest at night filling back in around the silence like water. I noted it in the log. Probable large mammal, north perimeter, 11:40 p.m. to approximately 11:55 p.m. Behavior non-aggressive. Unable to identify species. I went back to sleep. Days 7 and 8. The low-pressure system arrived early, not day 7 or 8 but the night of day 6, a few hours after I'd logged the perimeter sound and gone back to sleep. I woke at 3 a.m. to rain hammering the roof and stayed awake until it let up around 6. By the time first light came the forest was soaked, the ground soft, everything slick and steaming slightly in the cold morning air. The observation blind was compromised, the spruce I'd built it and shed water from every branch and the ground underneath had turned to mud, so I spent the morning at the station reviewing collar data and cross-referencing it with my observation notes. W3 had covered 14 kilometers in the previous 48 hours, a wider ranging pattern than the data from the collar team suggested was typical for this time of year. I noted the anomaly without a strong interpretation for it. Animals change their patterns for reasons that aren't always recoverable from the data. On the afternoon of day 7, when the rain had eased to a drizzle, I walked the perimeter of the station, something I did periodically as a general maintenance check, looking for anything that needed attention. Near the equipment shed, in the soft ground where the rain had pooled before draining, I found impressions. Not distinct enough to call tracks, the rain had been heavy enough to soften the edges of anything that had been made during the night, but the displacement of the mud suggested something had stood there. Something with weight. Something that had stood in one place long enough to sink slightly into the ground rather than just crossing it. I stood there for a while, looking at the impressions, and thought about the 14 kilometers W3 had covered, and the fact that wolves don't typically approach human structures directly, and the fact that whatever had made the sound the previous night had paused near this shed for 3 to 4 minutes. I checked the shed. The padlock was intact. Nothing inside had been disturbed. I went back to the station. Made dinner. Radioed Grant on schedule. Didn't mention the impressions. Day 8 was clear and cold. I spent 7 hours in the blind. W4 moved the pups again, a longer relocation this time, almost 40 meters, and in a direction that put them slightly further from my observation position. I noted this without interpreting it. The afternoon observation produced nothing remarkable. I returned to the station at 6:15 p.m., made my data entry, ate, read for 2 hours, and went to bed at 10. I woke at 2:17 a.m. No sound this time. Just awake, suddenly, the way you wake when something has changed in the environment rather than when something has started. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, not the active quiet of a place where something is present, but the total quiet that comes after something has recently left. The absence of sound that sounds different from ordinary silence. I got up. I went to the window. I looked out at the tree line, 30 meters from the station, the spruce starting where the cleared ground around the station ended. Nothing. Just trees and darkness and the faint shine of the clearing in the cloud-filtered moonlight. I went back to bed. I lay awake for a long time. In the morning, I found the first thing I couldn't explain. Day 9. The water tank. The station's water system was simple, a holding tank on the north side of the structure, fed by a pipe from a creek 80 meters uphill, with a manual shut-off valve that I was supposed to close at night during cold weather to prevent the pipe from freezing. The temperature had been above freezing every night since I'd arrived, so I hadn't been closing it. In the morning I would go to the tank, open the tap, fill my containers for the day, close the tap. On the morning of day 9, I went to fill my containers and found the tap already open. I stood there for a long time, trying to remember if I had left it open the previous evening. I ran through my routine from the night before. I had returned to the station at 6:15, made data entry, eaten, read, gone to bed at 10. I had not gone to the water tank after 6:15. I was certain of this. The tap was open. I checked the tank level. It hadn't drained significantly, whatever had been running during the night hadn't been long enough to empty it, or the flow rate was low enough that the tank had kept up. But it had been running. I filled my containers, closed the tap, and went inside. I sat at the desk for a while without opening my laptop. Then I got out my field log and I started writing down everything I could remember, in order: the chair, the perimeter sound on day 6, the impressions near the equipment shed on day 7, the quality of silence I'd woken to on day 8, and now this. Written out in sequence, in the daylight, it looked less like a pattern and more like a list of minor incidents that any isolated field station might accumulate in 9 days. A chair that moved, sounds in the forest, ambiguous marks in the mud, a tap left open. I was a biologist. I was trained to resist premature pattern recognition. Every field researcher knows the trap of the narrative, the way the human mind reaches for story before it has enough data to support one. I wrote down what I had observed. I did not write down what I was beginning to feel. What I was beginning to feel was that these things had not happened by accident. Days 10 and 11. I called Grant on day 10. Routine check-in. He asked how the pack was. I told him W4 had moved the pups twice more in the past 48 hours, further from my observation position each time, and that I was considering relocating the blind. He said that sounded reasonable. I asked him, casually, whether he'd had any visitors, hikers, hunters, anyone moving through the area. He laughed. "Nobody comes out this far," he said. "That's the point." I said, "Right, yeah, of course." And then I asked him whether there were any other structures in the area, old cabins, trappers' shelters, anything like that. He was quiet for a moment. He said he thought there might be an old trapping line somewhere to the northeast, but he hadn't seen it himself and wasn't sure if any of the structures were still standing. "Why?" I said I'd seen some old cut lines in the forest that didn't match the maps and was curious. He said cut lines from old trapping operations could persist for decades. Totally normal up here. I said yeah, that made sense. He said the next low-pressure system was probably 4 or 5 days out. I thanked him and signed off. I had not seen any cut lines. On day 11, I relocated the observation blind. The new position was 40 meters further from the den site and required me to use the spotting scope at higher magnification, which reduced detail but gave me a broader field of view. I told myself this was a data quality decision. The old position had been encroaching too close for the female's comfort. Her repeated pup relocations were probably a response to my presence. That was a reasonable interpretation. On the walk back from setting up the new blind, I stopped on the edge of the clearing and looked at the station. From this angle, from the tree line looking in, the station looked small and exposed. A rectangle of pale wood in the middle of cleared ground, windows dark in the afternoon light. I could see the main door, both outbuildings, the water tank, the solar panels, the antenna. I stood there for a while, looking at it. Then I thought, this is the angle from which something would watch it. And I turned around and went back inside. Days 12 and 13. Day 12 was the first day I found something that had no innocent explanation. I had established a habit of checking the perimeter each morning, the water tank, the equipment shed, the area around the generator, as part of a routine I told myself was standard maintenance protocol. It wasn't. I had never done perimeter checks at any other station. I was checking because I was looking for something, and I had not yet decided what that meant. On the morning of day 12, on the east side of the station, I found a piece of cord. It was about 40 centimeters long, paracord, olive green, tied in a loop. It was hanging from the lower branch of a spruce at the edge of the cleared ground, approximately at eye level. It had not been there the day before. I was certain of this because I had specifically checked that spruce the previous morning as part of my circuit, and I would have noticed it. The cord was not weathered. It was not frayed at the ends. It had been tied deliberately and recently. I looked at it for a long time. Paracord is standard equipment for anyone spending time in the wilderness. Hikers, hunters, trappers, researchers, everyone carries it. A loop of cord hanging from a tree at the edge of a clearing was not, in itself, evidence of anything threatening. It could have been left by a previous occupant of the station. It could have been left by the field crew that had done the original wolf collaring. It could have been left by anyone. I took it down. I put it in my pack. I wrote it in my log. That night, for the first time, I propped a chair under the door handle before I went to bed. Day 13, nothing visible. But the quality of the days was changing in a way I found difficult to articulate in the log. The forest felt different. Not louder, not more active, if anything, quieter. The birds that had been consistent background noise since day 1 were less present, or I was less able to hear them because I was listening for something else. I spent the morning observation in the new blind and found I was spending more time scanning the tree line behind me than I was watching the den site. W4 had moved the pups again. W3's ranging pattern had shifted. He was now moving primarily to the north, away from the station. I wrote this down. I tried to think about it as data. Day 14. The middle of the 3 weeks. The point from which it was as far back as it was forward. On the morning of day 14 I woke before my alarm and lay in the dark and did something I hadn't done since I was much younger and had not yet trained myself out of it. I was afraid to get up. Not of anything specific, not of an intruder in the station, not of anything I had seen or heard. Afraid of the morning check. Afraid of what the perimeter was going to show me. I got up anyway. That's the thing about fear. The only way to make it stop governing your behavior is to keep behaving regardless of it. The perimeter was clear. The water tap was closed. The equipment shed was locked. The cord was still in my pack where I'd put it. The tree line was still trees. I sat on the step outside the main door and drank my coffee and looked at the clearing and thought, you were alone out here. Whatever has been happening has an explanation that does not require anything to be out there. The chair moved because of a draft. The impressions in the mud were from a wolf or a bear. The tap was left open by you, during a night when you were tired and your routine slipped. The cord was left by someone who was here before you and is not here now. I held these explanations up and looked at them carefully, the way you look at a piece of evidence you want to be genuine. They were plausible. They were more parsimonious than the alternative. Every instinct I had developed as a scientist told me to default to the simpler explanation until the evidence made it untenable. The evidence made it untenable that afternoon. The photograph. I had been taking photographs throughout the study, documentation of the den site, the surrounding terrain, the collar signal receiver, standard visual records to accompany the observational data. That afternoon I was reviewing the previous week's images on my laptop, cross-referencing them with the location data from the collar terminal, when I found a photograph I didn't take. I want to be precise about this. The images on my camera's memory card were mine. I had taken all of them. I remembered taking all of them. I could account for each one in my log. The photograph I'm describing was not on the memory card. It was on the laptop's local drive, in the documentation folder I'd created for the project, in a subfolder labeled Terrain Reference that I used for landscape orientation shots. There were 34 images in that subfolder. I had taken 33 of them. The 34th was of the station. Taken from the tree line. From approximately the spot where I had stood on day 11 and thought, this is the angle from which something would watch it. The image showed the main cabin, both outbuildings, the water tank, the solar panels, the antenna. Taken during the day, the light suggested late morning or early afternoon. I could see, through the main window of the cabin, the shape of someone at the desk. Me. At the desk. Working. I sat with that photograph for a long time. My hands were very steady. I noticed this about my hands, that they weren't shaking, and I found this more disturbing than if they had been, because it meant some part of me had been expecting this. Some part of me had already arrived at the conclusion that my scientist's mind had been refusing to reach, and was simply waiting for the evidence to catch up. Someone had been out there. Someone had been close enough to use my laptop, which I left on the desk when I went to the blind, never locked, connected to the data uplink, and had placed this image in my documentation folder. Someone who knew how my file system was organized. Someone who had been watching me long enough to know where I worked and when I left and when I would be back. Someone who wanted me to know. I picked up the satellite phone. I held it for a long time. And then I put it back down. I put it back down because I needed to think before I called anyone. Because once I called Grant and said there's someone out here and they've been in my laptop, the study ended. The data collection ended. Whatever was happening ended, not because the person in the trees would leave, but because I would. And I wasn't ready to make that decision yet. I recognize how that sounds. I recognized it then. But I have spent enough time in remote locations to know that panic produces worse outcomes than method, and what I needed in that moment was method. I went back to the documentation folder. I looked at the photograph again. I noted the timestamp in the file metadata, 11:17 a.m., 6 days ago. Day 8. The morning after the night I'd woken to that particular silence. I made a copy of the photograph. I encrypted the copy and uploaded it to the university server through the data uplink. Then I went back to the satellite phone and I called Grant. I told him I needed to ask him something and I needed a straight answer. He said okay. I asked, in your time working out here, have you ever had any issues with people in the area? Uninvited people. People who shouldn't be there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what kind of issues? I said, someone has been on the station grounds. I've found evidence of it over the past week. Today I found a photograph on my laptop that I didn't take. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, I'm going to call the regional forestry office and have them send someone out. It'll take 2 days minimum. Are you safe right now? I looked at the window. I looked at the tree line. I said, I think so. He said, "Lock your doors tonight. Don't go out after dark. Keep the satellite phone with you." I said I would. I thanked him and signed off. I ate dinner. I did my data entry. I locked the door, the actual lock this time, the deadbolt, and the chair under the handle as well. I turned off the lamp earlier than usual. I sat in the dark for a while, listening. The forest was quiet. Days 15 and 16. Nothing happened on day 15. I say this not as relief but as its own form of information. Because by day 15, nothing happening felt different from nothing happening before. Before, silence was neutral. Now it was a choice. Whatever was out there was capable of nothing happening. That's not the same as it not being there. I went to the blind in the morning. I was not going to stop working. I was not going to let fear make that decision for me, and I spent 4 hours watching the dense sight and recording data that felt increasingly abstract against the reality of what was actually happening. W4 had moved the pups to a new location I couldn't observe from my current position. I would need to find a new blind. I didn't. I sat in the spruce for 4 hours and watched a patch of forest where a wolf family had been, and I thought about the photograph, and I thought about the chair, and I thought about the cord, and I thought about the systematic and patient quality of it, the way it had escalated slowly enough that each new thing was just barely outside the range of the previous thing, each step small enough to rationalize. That was what stayed with me most. The patience. Whatever was out there had been doing this long enough, and carefully enough, to understand exactly how to calibrate it. Exactly how much to show at each stage. Exactly when I was ready for the next piece of evidence. This was not random. This was not opportunistic. This had a shape. I came back from the blind at 1:30 p.m. I checked the perimeter. I sat at the desk. I looked at the photograph again. At 4:15 p.m. I went outside to check the equipment shed and found the padlock open. Not broken. Not forced. Open. The shackle released, the lock hanging from the hasp by its body. I stood in front of it for a moment. Then I pushed the door open. Everything was in order. Every piece of equipment in its place, correctly stored, nothing moved or damaged. The only evidence that anyone had been inside was the open padlock. And a piece of paper on the equipment shelf. It was a page from a field notebook, the same kind I used, grid, with the university's watermark in the corner. The handwriting was small and very even. It said, "You're doing good work. I've been watching the pack too." I stood there looking at it for a long time. Day 16 continued. I want to be careful here about what I tell you and how I tell it, because the temptation when describing this moment is to make it more dramatic than it was. The truth is that I didn't feel the shock I expected to feel. What I felt was something closer to clarity. The uncertainty, the weeks of uncertain observations, the careful not quite reaching the conclusion, the scientific discipline applied as a kind of psychological defense, all of that resolved. There was someone out there. They had been there for a long time. They knew about the wolf study. They had been inside the equipment shed. They had left me a note. I took the note. I put it in my pack with the cord. I relocked the shed. The lock had not been damaged, which meant they had a key or had picked it, and I didn't have a different lock to replace it with. I went inside. I called Grant. He told me the forestry office was sending 2 officers. They would arrive the following afternoon, weather permitting. He asked me again if I was safe. I told him about the note. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Stay inside tonight. Don't respond to anything you hear. If you feel like your safety is at risk, call emergency services directly, don't wait for me." I said I understood. That night was the longest of the 3 weeks. Not because anything happened, because nothing did. I sat in the dark station, lamp off, satellite phone in my hand, and listened to the forest for 8 hours. I heard the wind. I heard the generator cycle. I heard, at some point around 2 a.m., what might have been footsteps at the edge of the clearing, slow, deliberate, not trying to be quiet, not trying to be loud. Just present. Moving along the tree line to the north, pausing, moving again, and then gone. I didn't go to the window. I want to tell you I made that choice out of tactical discipline, that I had decided not to engage, not to signal my awareness of their presence. That's partly true. But the larger truth is that I did not go to the window because I was afraid of what I would see. Not afraid of a person. Afraid of the particular shape that the weeks of patient, calibrated, deliberate contact had given to whoever was out there in my mind. I had constructed something out of the evidence, and I didn't want to look at it and find out if I was right. At first light I unlocked the door and stepped outside and walked the perimeter. On the north side of the station, in the soft ground at the edge of the clearing, there were boot prints. Days 17, 18, and 19. The forestry officers arrived at 2:45 p.m. Two of them, in a truck that had taken 6 hours on roads that mostly weren't roads. They were professional and unhurried in the way that people who work in remote locations learn to be, not because nothing was serious, but because urgency without information is just noise. I showed them the boot prints. I showed them the open padlock location. I gave them the note, sealed in a plastic bag I'd found in the kitchen supplies. I showed them the photograph on my laptop. I told them about the sequence, the chair on day 6, the sounds, the impressions, the tap, the cord, all of it in order. The senior officer, a woman named Dufresne, 12 years in the position, the kind of person who has seen most things and holds her conclusions loosely until she has enough evidence, listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked me several questions in rapid succession. Had I seen anyone? No. Had I heard a voice? No. Had I felt at any point that my physical safety was in immediate danger? No. Had I touched the note with bare hands? No, I'd used my field gloves. Had I changed anything about the shed, the perimeter, the station since finding the note? No. She nodded. She told her partner to walk the perimeter and document the boot prints. Then she asked me whether I wanted to continue the study. I said I hadn't decided yet. She said that was a reasonable answer. They searched the immediate area, a 300-meter radius from the station, systematic, which took them most of the remaining daylight. They found the boot prints leading into the forest to the north, approximately 40 meters into the tree line, and then losing resolution on drier ground. They found, another 60 meters further, the remains of a fire, old, weeks old, in a natural clearing that would have been invisible from the station. A careful fire, in a pit, low smoke. The kind you make when you don't want to be seen. Dufresne came back and told me this without particular expression. I asked her what she thought. She said, someone has been camped near this station for an extended period. Based on the fire site and the progression of the incidents you've described, probably for most of your time here, possibly longer. The note and the photographs suggest deliberate contact. They wanted you to know they were there. Whether that's threatening or simply strange, I genuinely can't tell you right now. I asked whether she'd seen anything like this before. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, once. A long time ago, different province. The person turned out to be someone who had been living in the bush for several years. Not dangerous, just not willing to come back, and curious about anyone who came into their territory. She paused. She said, that time, they left before we arrived. She was telling me that this time, they might not have. That night, with both officers sleeping in the station, Dufresne on the second cot, her partner in a sleeping bag on the floor, I woke at 1:40 a.m. to a sound I recognized immediately. The slow movement along the tree line to the north. The same deliberate pace I'd heard on other nights. Present, unhurried, not trying to be quiet. I lay still and listened. After a moment I heard Dufresne's breathing change. She was awake too, listening. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The sound continued for perhaps 4 minutes and then stopped. In the morning, over coffee, she asked me if I'd heard anything during the night. I said yes. She said she had too. She didn't say anything else about it. but I noticed she spent a long time at the window before she came to the table, looking at the tree line with an expression I hadn't seen on her face the day before. Something had shifted in her assessment. Whatever she'd been holding loosely the previous afternoon, she was holding differently now. Her partner walked the north perimeter after breakfast and came back without speaking. He set his coffee down and looked at Dufresne. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. I didn't ask what they'd found. I didn't need to. They searched the area again that day, a wider radius this time, 500 meters, more thorough. They found nothing new. Whoever had walked the tree line the previous night had not left anything behind, had not approached closer than the tree line, had not done anything except make sure we knew they were still there. That was the part that stayed with me. Not that they had come despite the officers being present. That they had come because the officers were present. To demonstrate something. To make a point about what their presence did and didn't change. On the morning of day 19 the officers prepared to leave. Dufresne told me her office would send the ATV officer every 4 days. She gave me a direct number for the regional emergency line. She stood at the door of the station for a moment before getting in the truck, looking north at the tree line with that same changed expression. She said, "You don't have to stay." I said, "I know." She said, "But you're going to." It wasn't a question. I watched the truck disappear down the cut line that passed for a road, and then I was alone again. The clearing was quiet. The forest was quiet. Somewhere in the trees to the north, something that had walked the perimeter while 2 armed officers slept 20 meters away was still there, still watching, still entirely unwilling to be seen. And I had 5 more days of data to collect. Day 20. On day 20, in the late morning, I found a second note. Same field notebook paper, same small even handwriting, left on the step outside the main door sometime during the night. The female moved the pups because she knew you were there. She knew the whole time. You were never as hidden as you thought. I read it 3 times. Then I went inside and called Dufresne. She said she would send the ATV officer sooner than planned. She asked whether the note felt threatening. I thought about it. Then I said, "No. It feels like a conversation." She said that didn't necessarily make it safer. I said, "I know." I spent the rest of day 20 completing my data entry, running final checks on the equipment, beginning the process of closing down the station for the handover to the next researcher. In the evening I sat outside on the step and watched the light change over the clearing and thought about what the note had said. The female knew the whole time. She moved the pups not because she was afraid of me, but because she understood that I was there and made a calculated decision to increase the distance. She had been doing exactly what I had been doing, managing her awareness of a presence she couldn't entirely account for. I wondered if whoever was out there in the trees had been doing the same thing. That night I didn't put the chair under the door. Day 21. Last morning. I was up before dawn, packed everything that needed to go back with me, ran final checks on the equipment that was staying. Did one last observation session, 2 hours in the blind, good light, W4 and all 3 pups visible for the first time in days. I sat there longer than I needed to, longer than the data required. Then I walked back to the station, loaded my pack and my cases into the truck I'd arranged for pickup, and stood for a moment in the cleared ground in the early afternoon light. I looked at the tree line. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. Whatever I would have said felt insufficient, too small for the weight of 21 days, for the weight of that photograph, for the weight of someone patient and present and entirely willing to remain unknown. I got in the truck and I drove away. What came after? Dufresne's office conducted a more thorough search of the area 2 weeks after I left. They found the camp, what was left of it. A lean-to structure, well-built, maybe 600 meters north-northeast of the station, in a natural depression that made it essentially invisible from any approach. Evidence of long-term occupation, a food cache, processed game, equipment that had been in the bush long enough to be repaired multiple times. No indication of how long it had been there. It could have been months, it could have been years. No one was there when they found it. No one has been identified. The camp has since been cleared, but as Dufresne noted in her report, clearing a camp doesn't clear the person who built it. I have the photograph. I have both notes. I have the cord in a field notebook on my desk at the university where I sometimes look at it when I'm trying to remember what I learned out there and what I'm still in the process of learning. The wolf study data was clean. The paper is under review. W4's pup relocation behavior, cross-referenced with the collar data, produced an interesting secondary finding about maternal response to perceived observational pressure, about how the female's awareness of being watched changed her decision-making in ways that were measurable and consistent. My advisor called it one of the stronger datasets from that region in recent years. I think about that a lot. About what it means that the best data I've ever collected came out of the 3 weeks when I was least able to think about anything except what was in the trees. I still do field work. I went back to a different station in that region the following summer, a different project, different coordinates. On the second night, I woke at 2 a.m. to silence, that particular silence, the one that sounds different from ordinary silence, and lay in the dark for a long time, listening. Then I got up. I went to the window. I looked out at the tree line. I don't know what I expected to see. I don't know what I was hoping for. The tree line was just trees, and the clearing was just clearing, and the dark was just dark. Nothing watching. Nothing there. And I stood at that window for a long time anyway, because I have learned, in a way I cannot fully unlearn, in a way that has become part of how I move through the world now, that just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't there. It just means it doesn't want to be seen yet. If this stayed with you, if any part of it got under your skin the way it got under mine, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more of these. And the people in them didn't see it coming either.